Imagine a homeless boy stumbling upon a millionaire's wallet and discover a faded photograph of his mother inside, a mother he thought he knew everything about. Who was she? And why does a powerful rival want to use him as a pawn? This is a story of hidden truths, sacrifices, and a fight for love and redemption you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you never miss another one. The cold gnawed at Jace Carter's fingers as he crouched behind a row of overflowing trash cans. His threadbare jacket, far too thin for an Atlanta winter, did little to shield him from the icy winds slicing through the narrow alley. He shivered, pulling his knees tighter to his chest. The distant hum of traffic reminded him that life continued beyond his reality. People rushing home to warm houses, hot meals, and families who cared. Jace reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. It was worn and creased, but her smile remained intact. His mother, Renee Carter, looked radiant, her arms folded softly across her chest as though hugging the world. It was the only piece of her he had left, the anchor that kept him grounded when the streets felt like they might swallow him whole. He tucked the photo away quickly as footsteps echoed in the alley. Survival instincts told him to stay hidden. A figure emerged at the other end. A man in a sharp suit, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Jace watched him as he muttered into a phone, his tone brisk and impatient. "No, reschedule the meeting," the man barked. "Yes, I understand they're flying in. It doesn't matter. I've got something more pressing." Jace shifted slightly to get a better view. The man's posture screamed power and wealth, the kind that Jace had only glimpsed from a distance. But now here he was, right in the middle of the alley, an anomaly in this forgotten corner of the city. As the man adjusted his scarf, his leather wallet slipped from his pocket and landed with a soft thud on the ground. Jace froze. His heart raced as his eyes darted between the wallet and the man, who walked on obliviously. Jace didn't move until the man turned the corner and disappeared from sight. He crept toward the wallet, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands. The leather felt smooth, expensive, a far cry from the ragged backpack he carried. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching before carefully opening it. The sight of crisp bills inside made his stomach twist. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and his hunger screamed for relief. Jace's fingers hovered over the money, his body trembling. Not from the cold, but from the war raging inside him. He could take it. No one would know. The man was wealthy enough to replace it without a second thought. But then he heard it. His mother's voice, soft and certain. "Jace, no matter how hard things get, always do the right thing. Honesty will guide you through the storm." Her words echoed in his mind, steadying his trembling hands. Jace closed the wallet, clutching it tightly as he stood. The money wasn't his, and taking it wouldn't solve his problems. It would only make him forget who he was. He hesitated, looking toward the street. What if the man had already left? What if this act of honesty was for nothing? He shook the doubts away. He had to try. Jace sprinted toward the sidewalk, scanning the busy street for any sign of the man. Spotting the distinctive gray scarf, he called out, "Sir! Hey, sir!" His voice cracked from the cold, but it carried just enough to make the man stop and turn. The man's sharp blue eyes fell on Jace, narrowing slightly as they took in his disheveled appearance. "Yes?" he asked, his tone cautious. "You dropped this," Jace said, holding out the wallet with both hands. He kept his gaze low, feeling the weight of the man's scrutiny. The man stared at the wallet, then at Jace as though trying to comprehend the situation. Slowly, he took the wallet from Jace's outstretched hands. "You're returning this to me?" he asked, disbelief lacing his words. Jace nodded. "It's yours. Fell out of your pocket." For a moment, the man said nothing. His expression softened, and he reached into the wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Here," he said, extending it to Jace. "For your honesty." Jace hesitated, his stomach growling in protest. Eventually, he reached out and accepted the money, mumbling, "Thank you." As the man adjusted his scarf and turned to leave, something slipped from the wallet. Jace bent to pick it up, a photograph, worn and slightly creased. He froze as his eyes locked on the image. It was his mother. She was younger, her arms around a man Jace didn't recognize, both smiling warmly at the camera. Jace's breath hitched and his legs felt weak beneath him. How did this stranger have a picture of his mother? His chest tightened as he stared at the photograph. Questions flooded his mind, each one louder than the last. He clutched the photograph tightly, his pulse racing. "Sir, wait!" Jace called out. But the man was already gone, disappearing into the sea of bustling commuters. Jace stood frozen on the sidewalk, the photograph clutched in his hand, his heart pounding with confusion and the faintest flicker of hope. The photograph weighed heavily in Jace's hand, as if the answers to his entire life were folded into the worn edges of the image. He stood motionless on the crowded Atlanta street, the noise and movement around him reduced to a distant hum. His mother, Renee Carter, her smile so familiar it hurt, stared back at him from the photograph. The man standing beside her, arms casually slung around her shoulders, was a stranger, but the ease and affection in the pose suggested he had once meant something to her. Jace's mind raced. Who was this man? What was his connection to his mother? And why had this wealthy stranger, Elliot Hargrave, been carrying the photograph? The thought made his stomach twist. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. He slipped the photograph into his pocket, his fingers trembling. If Elliot had known Renee, then maybe, just maybe, he could answer the questions Jace had been asking himself for years. Where had his mother come from? Why had her life been so hard? And why, after all her sacrifices, had she left Jace alone to fend for himself? Jace turned to follow the path Elliot had taken, but the man was long gone, swallowed by the bustling streets of Atlanta. Frustration bubbled in his chest. He clenched his fists, the $100 bill crumpling in his palm. That money could buy him food, a coat, maybe even a warm bed for the night. But it couldn't answer the questions burning in his mind. The photograph was all Jace could think about as he trudged back to the abandoned warehouse he called home. The wind had picked up, biting through the holes in his jacket, but the cold was secondary to the storm raging in his head. He pushed through the gap in the chain-link fence, slipping into the dilapidated building and up the creaking stairs to his makeshift room. The small space was little more than 3 crumbling walls and a corner shielded from the rain by rotting plywood. But it was the closest thing Jace had to a sanctuary. He dropped his backpack on the floor and pulled out the photograph, holding it up to the weak light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. "Mom," he whispered, running his finger along the edge of her face. She looked so happy, so full of life, nothing like the worn, weary woman he remembered from her final days. Jace's voice cracked as he continued, "Who is this guy? Did he care about you? Did he care about me?" The questions hung in the stale air, unanswered. Jace leaned back against the wall, the photograph resting on his chest. His memories of Renee were precious but fragmented, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. He remembered her laughter, the smell of her cheap jasmine perfume, and the warmth of her arms around him as she read bedtime stories. But those moments were fleeting, swallowed by the shadow of her illness and the years of struggle that followed. Jace thought back to the day she had died, her voice barely a whisper as she told him she loved him. He had clung to her hand, willing her to stay, but she had slipped away, leaving him with nothing but the photograph and the lessons she had instilled in him. Honesty, resilience, love. Now, staring at the image of her younger self, Jace felt a mix of longing and anger. If Elliot had been part of her life, why wasn't he there for her when she needed him most? And if he wasn't, why did he have this photograph? Jace's jaw tightened. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them sitting in this broken-down room. The next morning, Jace made his way to the only place he thought might offer a clue, Maggie's corner by the bus station. Maggie was a middle-aged woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She had taken Jace under her wing when he first ended up on the streets, teaching him how to navigate shelters, avoid danger, and keep his head down when trouble came looking. If anyone could help him figure out what to do, it was her. Jace found her where he always did, perched on an old milk crate with a frayed blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was sipping coffee from a chipped thermos, her eyes scanning the street like a hawk. "What's got you all worked up, kid?" she asked as Jace approached. You look like you've seen a ghost." Jace hesitated, then pulled out the photograph and handed it to her. Maggie squinted at it, her brow furrowing. "That's your mom, isn't it?" she said, glancing up at him. Jace nodded. "Yeah, but the guy next to her, I don't know who he is. I found this in some guy's wallet yesterday. He didn't say anything about it, just gave me money and left." Maggie's expression darkened. "Rich guy, huh? Let me guess. Fancy suit, expensive car, probably didn't even look at you twice." Jace nodded again, and Maggie let out a bitter laugh. "Figures. Those types don't care about people like us, kid. They've got their own little world, and we're nothing but background noise." "But he had this picture," Jace pressed. "He knew my mom. I need to know how." Maggie studied the photograph again, her lips tightening. "I don't know, kid, but be careful. Rich folks like that, they don't just carry around pictures of people for no reason. If you push too hard, you might not like what you find." Jace's stomach twisted at her words, but the resolve in his chest hardened. He didn't have a choice. He needed answers, no matter the cost. Maggie's words echoed in Jace's mind as he trudged back through the city streets. "Be careful," she'd said, her tone a mix of caution and something that sounded almost like fear. The photograph of his mother tucked safely in his pocket felt heavier with every step. He couldn't stop replaying Maggie's warning. Why would she be so concerned? What could she possibly know about a man like Elliot Hargrave? Jace found himself wandering aimlessly, his thoughts a tangled mess. The streets were alive with the usual chaos. Bustling vendors shouting over one another, the occasional honk of a frustrated driver, and the steady hum of life that carried on no matter how stuck he felt. It was all background noise as he grappled with the weight of Maggie's advice and the burning questions about his mother's past. He stopped near a park bench and sat down, the photograph once again in his hand. Renee's smile seemed almost to mock him now. She looked so happy, so carefree. Jace stared at the face of the man next to her, trying to imagine the version of Elliot Hargrave that might have been in her life. Was he kind? Had he loved her? Or was he just another person who had let her down? Maggie's voice rang through his head again. "Rich folks like that, they don't carry pictures of people for no reason." The truth of it settled uneasily in Jace's chest. He needed to know why Elliot had kept that photo. But Maggie's warning left him hesitant to act too quickly. Later that evening, Jace returned to the old warehouse he called home, his thoughts still spinning. The dim, flickering light from a nearby street lamp barely illuminated the room. He pulled out the photograph and set it next to his mother's other picture, the one he'd carried with him since she passed. He studied them side by side, looking for answers in her face, in her eyes, in the faint laugh lines that framed her lips. He had never felt more alone or more confused. A knock on the wall startled him. Maggie's familiar, raspy voice followed. "Hey, kid, you in there?" Jace scrambled to his feet, sliding the photograph back into his pocket before opening the door. Maggie stepped inside, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the small room. "You look like you've been chewing on your own thoughts all day," she said, settling onto a crate near the corner. Jace sighed and sat down across from her. "I can't stop thinking about it, Maggie. Why would he have her picture? What does it mean?" Maggie let out a long breath, rubbing her hands together to warm them. "I don't know, kid, but I've been on these streets long enough to know one thing. Rich folks like him, they don't cross paths with people like us unless there's something they want. You don't want to be what he wants." Jace frowned. "But what if he can tell me about her? What if he knows things I don't? Don't I deserve to know?" Maggie's expression softened. "You do, Jace. You deserve to know everything about your mom. But you also deserve to be safe. And people like him, they play by different rules. They don't think about what happens to people like us when their games get messy." Jace shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't care about his games. I just want answers. She's my mom, Maggie. She's all I've got left." Maggie sighed, reaching into her pocket and pulling out her battered thermos. "You're stubborn. I'll give you that. Just like your mom was. She wouldn't back down either. But you need to be smart about this, Jace. If you go charging into his world without a plan, you're going to get hurt." Jace clenched his fists, the weight of her words sinking in. "So what do I do? Just let it go?" Maggie shook her head. "I didn't say that. I'm saying don't go alone. Let me help you. Let's figure this out together. But we've got to be careful, okay? Jace looked at her, seeing the worry etched into her face. Maggie wasn't just another person trying to keep him safe. She cared about him. She'd been there when no one else was. And maybe she was right. Rushing into this without a plan wasn't the answer. Okay, he said finally. We'll figure it out. Together. Maggie nodded, relief flickering across her features. Good. Now, let's start small. Tomorrow we'll go back to that spot where you saw him. Maybe we can figure out more about him without stirring the pot. Jace nodded, a tentative sense of hope replacing some of his frustration. Maggie's steady presence was exactly what he needed, even if he didn't always want to admit it. As the night wore on, Jace found himself staring at the photograph again, the questions still swirling in his mind. But now, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in his search for answers. Maggie was right. He needed to be smart, to be careful. But no matter what, he wasn't going to give up. Not until he knew the truth about Renee and the man who seemed to hold a piece of her story. Maggie's plan had been simple. Return to the spot where Jace had found Elliot Hargrave and observe. No rushing in, no making a scene. Patience, kid, she'd said, her voice firm but kind. Answers don't come to people who don't know how to wait. But patience wasn't Jace's strong suit, not when the photograph in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole straight through him. He'd spent the entire night staring at it, replaying every detail of his mother's face and the stranger's arm draped around her shoulders. Each glance only deepened his determination to uncover the truth. The next morning, Jace stood near the same spot on the busy Atlanta street where he'd first seen Elliot. Maggie had stayed back at her usual corner, watching from a distance with her sharp, hawk-like gaze. Jace's heart thudded in his chest every time a man in a suit passed by, but none of them was Elliot. Then, as the late morning sun cut through the crisp winter air, Jace spotted him. Elliot Hargrave stepped out of a sleek black car, his phone pressed to his ear. He was dressed just as impeccably as before, his coat immaculate, his shoes gleaming. Jace felt a surge of nervous energy rush through him. This was it. Without waiting for Maggie's signal, Jace pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Hargrave!" he called, his voice cutting through the noise of the busy street. Elliot stopped mid-step, turning toward the sound of his name. His piercing blue eyes landed on Jace, narrowing slightly as recognition dawned. "You again," he said, his tone more curious than annoyed. He ended his phone call with a sharp, "I'll call you back." Jace stepped closer, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "I need to talk to you about this." He pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it out with trembling fingers. Elliot's eyes flicked to the photograph, and for a brief moment, his composed demeanor faltered. A flicker of something, shock, guilt, maybe even pain, crossed his face before he quickly schooled his expression. He reached for the photograph, but Jace didn't let go. "You knew her, didn't you?" Jace's voice wavered, but his grip on the photo remained firm. "You knew my mom." Elliot's jaw tightened. He glanced around the busy street, then back at Jace. "Not here," he said curtly. "Follow me." Elliot led Jace into the towering office building nearby, the marble floors and polished brass fixtures gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Jace had never felt more out of place. His worn sneakers squeaked against the pristine floor, and he caught the disapproving stares of passing employees. The receptionist, a stern-looking woman with sharp features, raised an eyebrow as Elliot approached with Jace in tow. "Mr. Hargrave, should I call security?" "That won't be necessary," Elliot replied, his voice calm but firm. "Hold my calls." Jace followed him into the elevator, the silence between them oppressive. When the doors opened to the top floor, Elliot gestured for Jace to step out first. His office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. But Jace barely noticed. His focus remained on Elliot as the man closed the door behind them. "Now," Elliot said, moving behind his massive desk. "Let's talk. What do you want from me?" Jace took a deep breath, clutching the photograph tightly. "I want to know who you are, who you were to my mom. Why do you have this picture?" Elliot sank into his chair, his eyes fixed on the photograph. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. Your mother, Renee Carter. She was someone I knew a long time ago. Jace's heart pounded in his chest. That's it? Someone you knew? She's my mom, and you've been carrying around her picture like she's some stranger you barely remember. Elliot flinched at the sharpness in Jace's tone. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, disrupting its perfection. It's complicated, he said, his voice tinged with regret. Try me, Jace shot back, his frustration boiling over. I've been living on the streets for years. My mom died, and I've been alone ever since. You don't get to brush me off with it's complicated. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression conflicted. I loved your mother, he admitted quietly. We were young and He paused, choosing his words carefully. We had a connection, but things didn't work out. Life pulled us in different directions. Jace's stomach twisted. It wasn't enough, not even close. Did you know about me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's eyes met Jace's, and for the first time Jace saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. No, Elliot said, shaking his head. I didn't. Not until now. Jace took a step back, his hands trembling. He wanted to believe Elliot, but doubt gnawed at him. How could this man have been such a big part of his mother's life and not know about him? Why should I believe you? Jace asked, his voice cracking. Why should I trust anything you say? Elliot stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. I don't expect you to trust me, he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. But if you're willing to give me the chance, I'll tell you everything I know about your mother, about us. The room fell silent, the weight of Elliot's words hanging between them. Jace hesitated, his heart torn between the fear of being hurt and the desperate need for answers. Okay, he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. I'm listening. The office felt suffocating despite its size, the tension between Jace and Elliot thick enough to silence the faint hum of the city outside. Jace's mind reeled from Elliot's admission. He had loved Renee, but life had separated them. It sounded like an excuse, an empty justification for years of abandonment. Yet there was something about the way Elliot had said it, a rawness in his voice that left Jace torn between disbelief and the faintest flicker of hope. Elliot motioned for Jace to sit in one of the plush leather chairs across from his desk. You deserve the truth, he said, his tone measured but heavy with regret. But it's not an easy story to tell. Jace reluctantly took the seat, clutching the photograph like a shield. Start from the beginning, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. How did you know my mom? Elliot leaned back in his chair, his sharp features softening as his gaze drifted to the photograph on the desk. It was over 20 years ago. I was fresh out of business school, full of ambition and arrogance. My family had a reputation to uphold, old money, deeply entrenched in Atlanta's social circles. But I wanted something different. I wanted to prove myself away from their influence. His voice grew quieter, tinged with nostalgia. That's when I met Renee. She was working at a diner downtown, saving up for community college. She had this spark about her, this way of lighting up a room just by being in it. I fell for her fast, and for the first time, I felt free. Jay swallowed hard, imagining his mother in a different light, young, vibrant, full of dreams. It was a side of her he'd never seen, and the image was both comforting and painful. But my family, Elliot continued, his jaw tightening, they didn't approve. My father especially. He called Renee a distraction, someone who didn't belong in our world. He threatened to cut me off if I didn't end things with her. Jace's hands balled into fists. So you just left her? Because your dad told you to? Elliot flinched at the accusation, his composure cracking. I was a coward, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could protect her by walking away. My father wasn't just threatening me. He would have made her life unbearable. At the time, I convinced myself it was for the best. Jace shook his head, his anger bubbling to the surface. You didn't protect her. You abandoned her. Do you know what she went through? How hard it was for her to take care of me? Elliot's eyes widened. You were born after I left? The realization seemed to hit him like a blow, and he sank deeper into his chair. I didn't know, Jace. I swear to you, I didn't know. Jace's voice cracked as he pressed on. She worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat, And when she got sick, there was no one to help us. She died alone, and I've been alone ever since." The weight of Jace's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Elliot looked truly vulnerable. "If I had known," he said, his voice trembling, "I would have come back. I would have done everything I could to help her, to help you." Jace's chest ached with the weight of conflicting emotions: anger, grief, and a desperate longing for the mother he'd lost. He pulled the photograph closer, searching it for answers that weren't there. Elliot reached into a drawer, pulling out a small wooden box. He placed it on the desk, his movements deliberate. "After Renee and I parted ways, I tried to move on, but I couldn't. I wrote her letters, dozens of them, but I never sent them. I kept this," he said, opening the box to reveal a collection of faded envelopes and small trinkets. "It was all I had left of her." Jace stared at the contents of the box: concert tickets, a pressed flower, a cheap locket. Each item seemed to tell a story, fragments of a life he'd never known. His fingers hovered over the letters, hesitant to touch them. "Why didn't you ever send these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot looked down, shame etched into his features. "Because I was too afraid. I thought she'd hate me for what I'd done, and by the time I worked up the courage to find her, it was too late. She was gone." The room fell silent, the enormity of Elliot's regret palpable. Jace's heart felt heavy, his anger tempered by the raw pain in Elliot's voice. He didn't know if he could forgive him, not yet, but for the first time, he saw a man trying to make amends, however imperfectly. Jace took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Elliot's. "I don't know if I can trust you," he said honestly, "but if you really want to make things right, you'll help me figure out the rest. You owe me that much." Elliot nodded solemnly. "You're right, I do, and I will." As Jace stood to leave, his eyes lingered on the box of letters. It was a puzzle piece he hadn't expected, a glimpse into a past he'd only ever imagined. But there were still so many pieces missing, and Jace knew the road to finding them would be anything but easy. Jace left Elliot's office with his head swimming. The box of unsent letters, the regret etched into Elliot's voice, all of it stirred something in him he wasn't ready to name. He wasn't sure if he believed Elliot or even if he wanted to, but one thing was certain: his mother's past was more complicated than he had ever imagined. Answers seemed within reach, but so did more questions, and that left Jace feeling both hopeful and uneasy. As Jace navigated the crowded streets of Atlanta, his mind returned to Maggie's warning. "Rich folks like him, they don't cross paths with people like us unless there's something they want." Elliot had sworn he didn't know about Jace until now, but Maggie's words lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Unbeknownst to Jace, another shadow had begun to creep into his life. Elliot's return to his personal past hadn't gone unnoticed. Across town, in a sleek, modern office that contrasted sharply with the warmth of Elliot's, Victor Crane leaned back in his leather chair, a smug grin on his face. Victor had been Elliot's competitor for years, a relentless, cunning businessman who thrived on uncovering weaknesses and exploiting them. Victor swirled his glass of scotch, his gaze fixed on a report his assistant had just placed before him. "A boy," he said, his tone laced with intrigue, "homeless, young, and somehow connected to Elliot Hargrave." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied, shifting nervously under Victor's scrutiny. "Our sources say the boy's been seen entering Hargrave's building and speaking with him directly." Victor's grin widened. Well, this is interesting. Elliot Hargrave, champion of corporate integrity with a secret connection to a street rat. He set the glass down and leaned forward. "Find out everything you can about this kid. Where he's been, who he talks to, what he wants. And keep it quiet. If Hargrave has a weakness, I want it exposed." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, are you sure we should—" Victor cut him off with a sharp glare. "Do you want to question me or do you want to keep your job?" The assistant nodded quickly and left the room, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. He tapped a finger against the desk, already planning his next move. This boy could be the leverage he needed to bring Elliot down, and Victor wasn't about to let the opportunity slip away. That evening, as Jace returned to the warehouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, his pulse quickening every time he thought he saw movement in the shadows. He tightened his grip on the photograph in his pocket, telling himself he was just being paranoid. When he slipped through the gap in the fence, Maggie was waiting for him, her expression unusually serious. "Took you long enough," she muttered, motioning for him to sit. "We've got a problem." Jace frowned, sitting on the edge of an overturned crate. "What do you mean?" Maggie glanced toward the broken window as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Word travels fast on the streets, kid. Someone's been asking about you. Big guy in a suit, real slick. Doesn't belong around here." Jace's stomach dropped. "Who? Why would anyone be looking for me?" Maggie's gaze hardened. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But listen to me, Jace. This isn't good. Whoever this guy is, he's not here to help you. You need to keep your head down and stay out of sight until we know what we're dealing with." Jace bristled at the suggestion. "I can't just hide. I need to find out what's going on with Elliot and my mom. If someone's looking for me, maybe it's because they know something." Maggie grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "Or maybe it's because they want something from you, something dangerous. You think these people care about you, Jace? They don't. They see you as a pawn, and if you're not careful, you're going to get played." Jace pulled away, frustration bubbling in his chest. "I can take care of myself, Maggie. I've been doing it for years." "Yeah?" Maggie shot back. "And how's that been working out for you?" The words stung, but Jace knew she was right. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. "What do I do then? Just wait around for them to find me?" "No," Maggie said firmly. "We stay smart. We keep moving, keep our eyes open. And we don't trust anyone, especially not Elliot Hargrave." Jace hesitated. "What if he's not the bad guy? What if he really didn't know about me?" Maggie sighed, her expression softening. "Maybe he's not the bad guy, but you're not the first kid I've seen get chewed up and spit out by people like him. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Jace said, though the words felt hollow. He couldn't ignore the growing danger, but he also couldn't walk away from the chance to learn the truth about his mother. No matter what Maggie said, he wasn't going to let fear stop him. As the two sat in the dim light of the warehouse, neither of them noticed the figure lingering just outside the fence, watching through the cracks. Victor Crane's men were thorough, and they had found their target. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was far from clear and far more dangerous than Jace could imagine. The shadows of Victor Crane's scheme loomed over Jace's every step, though he didn't yet realize how close danger had crept. Maggie's warnings echoed in his mind as he made his way to Elliot's office building, the photograph burning a hole in his pocket. Answers weren't just something he wanted anymore. They were something he needed. The questions about his mother's past and Elliot's connection to her consumed his thoughts, drowning out his fear. He didn't tell Maggie where he was going. He couldn't risk her trying to stop him again. Elliot Hargrave was waiting when Jace arrived, his office dimly lit, the city skyline glittering in the background. The quiet hum of the heater filled the silence between them as Jace stepped inside. Elliot gestured toward the same chair Jace had sat in before, his expression unreadable. "You're back," Elliot said evenly, though there was a tension in his voice. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk again after last time." Jace didn't sit. "I don't have time for pleasantries," he said, pulling the photograph from his pocket. My mom. What aren't you telling me?" Elliot's shoulders tensed, but he didn't avert his gaze. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "You're right. You deserve to know everything." He motioned for Jace to take a seat again, and reluctantly, Jace complied. Elliot leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "But what I'm about to tell you, it won't be easy to hear." Jace braced himself. "I can handle it." Elliot exhaled deeply before speaking. "Your mother, Renee, she was the love of my life. When we met, I was at a crossroads, caught between the expectations of my family and my own desires. She was everything I wasn't, free-spirited, kind, unshakably resilient. She grounded me, gave me a sense of purpose I'd never had before." His voice softened, tinged with regret. "But my father, he didn't approve. He saw her as a threat to the future he'd planned for me. He used every weapon in his arsenal: threats, money, manipulation. I thought I was protecting her by walking away, but the truth is I was protecting myself. I was weak. Jace's jaw clenched. And then what? You just left her to fend for herself? Did you even try to find out what happened to her after you left? Elliot winced at the accusation. I tried, he said quietly. Years later, after my father passed, I started looking for her. But by then she was gone. The trail ended at the shelter where she used to volunteer. They told me about her illness, her strength in the face of it, and you. Jace froze. Me? Elliot nodded, his expression heavy with sorrow. They told me she had a son. Your name, Thomas Carter. It was all I had to go on. I hired private investigators, searched the foster care system, but you were nowhere to be found. I thought I'd lost you too. Jace's heart pounded, anger and confusion swirling in his chest. You should have tried harder. You should have been there when she needed you, when I needed you. I know, Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, Jace, and I want to make things right. The words hung in the air, but before Jace could respond, a loud knock shattered the tension. Elliot's assistant stepped into the room, her face pale. Mr. Hargrave, there's a situation downstairs. Security says a man has been asking about you and the boy. He's being insistent. Elliot's expression darkened. Who? Victor Crane. The name sent a chill down Jace's spine. Elliot's jaw tightened as he rose from his chair. Stay here, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll handle this. But Jace wasn't about to stay put. As soon as Elliot left, Jace moved to the window, peering down at the street below. A sleek car was parked outside, and a man he didn't recognize was pacing near the entrance, flanked by two others. They looked sharp, polished, and dangerous. A knot of unease formed in Jace's stomach. He had no idea who Victor Crane was or why he cared about Elliot, but the sight of him filled Jace with a sense of impending doom. Elliot returned a few minutes later, his face grim. Victor Crane is a rival of mine, he explained. He must have found out about you somehow, and he's trying to use you against me. Use me? Jace echoed, his unease growing. Elliot nodded. Victor doesn't care about you, Jace. He only cares about how he can hurt me. And if he thinks you're important to me, he'll try to exploit that. We need to be careful. Jace's frustration boiled over. Careful? I didn't ask for any of this. All I wanted was to know about my mom, and now I'm caught in the middle of some feud I don't even understand. Elliot's gaze softened. I know this isn't fair to you, but you're not alone in this, Jace. I won't let him hurt you, I promise. For the first time, Jace saw something in Elliot's eyes that he hadn't noticed before. Determination, not for his own sake, but for Jace's. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to quiet the storm in his chest, if only for a moment. As they prepared to leave, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Crane's appearance was only the beginning. The answers he sought about his mother were tangled in a web far more dangerous than he had anticipated. And as much as he wanted to trust Elliot, Maggie's warning still echoed in his mind. Be careful who you trust. Jace's mind raced as he left Elliot's office, the weight of the confrontation with Victor Crane hanging over him. Elliot's assurances had done little to calm his nerves. Victor wasn't just a rival, he was a threat, and Jace felt like a pawn in a game he barely understood. His fingers brushed against the photograph in his pocket, his mother's face anchoring him as he walked through the cold streets of Atlanta. The warehouse felt unusually quiet when Jace arrived. Maggie was sitting on a stack of crates, her expression darker than usual. The moment she saw him, she stood, her sharp eyes scanning him for signs of trouble. You've been with him again, haven't you? She asked, her voice low but edged with worry. Jace nodded. I had to, Maggie. He's the only one who can tell me the truth about my mom. Maggie let out a frustrated sigh. And what about the truth you don't want to hear, Jace? You think people like him, people like Victor Crane, play fair? You're walking into something bigger than you can handle. Then help me, Jace snapped, his voice cracking with desperation. You're always telling me to be careful, but I can't keep running blind. I need answers, Maggie. I need to know who my mom really was and why all of this is happening. Maggie's features softened, the fire in her eyes dimming to a weary sadness. Kid, I've been in this world a long time. I've seen what people like them do to people like us, and it doesn't end well. She paused, her voice quieter now. But I know you're not going to stop, so I'll help you. But you've got to trust me. The next day, Jace and Maggie worked together to gather information. Maggie tapped into her network of street contacts, her years on the fringe of society paying off in ways Jace had never fully appreciated before. Rumors of Victor Crane's dealings painted a grim picture. He was ruthless, manipulative, and had no qualms about using underhanded tactics to get what he wanted. By evening, Maggie had pieced together enough to confirm Jace's worst fears. Victor wasn't just interested in hurting Elliot. He wanted leverage, and Jace was the perfect tool. But what Victor planned to do with that leverage remained unclear. We need to keep you out of sight, Maggie said firmly. If Victor gets his hands on you, there's no telling what he'll do. Jace clenched his fists, anger and fear warring in his chest. I'm not running, Maggie. Not this time. Then we'll make sure you're ready, Maggie replied, her resolve matching his. But we're doing this my way, no reckless moves. As night fell, the warehouse grew eerily quiet. Maggie kept a close watch, her instincts honed by years of survival on the streets. Jace sat in the corner staring at the photograph of his mother. He wondered what she would have done in his position, whether she would have had the strength to face someone like Victor Crane. The thought both comforted and terrified him. A sudden noise outside shattered the silence. Maggie's head snapped toward the sound and she motioned for Jace to stay put. Don't move, she whispered, grabbing the small pocket knife she always kept with her. I'll handle this. Jace's heart pounded as Maggie slipped through the gap in the fence. He crouched low, straining to hear what was happening outside. The muffled sound of voices reached him, followed by a sharp shout. His stomach twisted as dread washed over him. Before he could think, Jace darted to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Maggie stood facing two men in dark suits, Victor Crane's lackeys. One of them grabbed her arm, but Maggie didn't flinch. Her voice carried over the distance, defiant and unwavering. You've got the wrong idea, she said, her tone sharp. The boy's gone. You're wasting your time. Jace's chest tightened. He wanted to rush out to stop them, but he froze as Maggie glanced back toward the warehouse. Her eyes met his through the cracked window, and in that moment, he understood what she was doing. She was protecting him. One of the men said something Jace couldn't make out, and Maggie laughed bitterly. You think you scare me? I've dealt with worse than you. Jace clenched his fists, his body trembling with frustration. He couldn't just watch this happen, but he knew Maggie wouldn't forgive him if he got caught. Her voice echoed in his mind. Don't be stupid, kid. You've got too much to lose. The men pulled Maggie toward their car, but she didn't struggle. She walked with them, her back straight, her head held high. Jace pressed his forehead against the window, helplessness clawing at his chest as the car drove away, its taillights disappearing into the night. Maggie was gone, and Jace was alone again. But as the silence of the warehouse enveloped him, something inside him shifted. Maggie's sacrifice wasn't just an act of protection. It was a call to action. She had put herself on the line for him, and he wasn't going to let that be in vain. He wiped his eyes, the photograph of his mother still clutched in his hand. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of his resolve. I won't let you down, Maggie. I'll finish this, for you, for her. The echo of the car fading into the distance left Jace standing in the cold, his chest tight with a storm of emotions. Maggie's defiant glance through the cracked window was seared into his mind. She had given herself up to protect him, and the weight of that sacrifice pressed on him like a heavy stone. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. But Jace was no longer just a boy with questions about his past. Maggie's words and her sacrifice had lit a fire within him. He knew he needed to be smarter, stronger, and he knew exactly who could help him. Elliot Hargrave. Elliot opened his office door to find Jace standing in the hall, his shoulders stiff, his face pale but determined. The contrast between the boy's ragged appearance and the sleek opulence of the office building had never been starker. Without waiting for an invitation, Jace stepped inside, his gaze meeting Elliot's. We need to talk, Jace said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Elliot nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. Of course, what's happened? Jace hesitated, his fists clenching at his sides. Maggie's gone, he said finally. Victor's men took her. She was protecting me. Elliot's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his expression a mix of concern and guilt. Jace, I didn't know Victor would take it this far. I'm so sorry. Sorry's not enough, Jace snapped, his voice rising. She's in trouble because of you, because of me, and I can't just sit here and wait. We need to get her back. Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're right. This is my fault, and I'll do everything I can to fix it. But rushing into this without a plan could make things worse. Jace's eyes flashed with frustration. Then what do we do? Sit here and hope Victor decides to let her go? No, Elliot said firmly. We fight smart. Victor thrives on leverage, but he doesn't act without calculation. If we can find out what he wants, why he's so interested in you, we can use that against him. Jace hesitated, his mind spinning. How do we figure that out? Elliot stood and walked to the window, his gaze distant. Victor and I have been rivals for years, but this is personal. He must know something about you, something that connects you to me in a way he can exploit. If we can uncover what that is, we might be able to force his hand. Jace thought of the photograph in his pocket, the one that had started it all. He pulled it out and placed it on Elliot's desk. This is all I have. This, and the truth about my mom. Elliot picked up the photograph, his expression softening as he studied it. Renee, he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. She never stopped surprising me. Jace leaned forward, his frustration giving way to desperation. If you really loved her, then prove it. Help me. Help Maggie. Don't just stand there and watch while Victor tears everything apart. Elliot's gaze met Jace's, a spark of determination lighting in his eyes. You're right. I owe it to her and to you. But we need to work together, Jace. This isn't just about uncovering the past, it's about protecting the future. The next day, Jace and Elliot began their plan. While Elliot tapped into his network of business associates and private investigators, Jace followed Maggie's advice to stay out of sight. But staying hidden didn't mean staying idle. Jace reached out to the few people on the streets he trusted, hoping to gather any scraps of information about Victor's men or where they might have taken Maggie. The process was slow and frustrating, but Jace found solace in Elliot's unwavering commitment. Though he was still grappling with his own doubts about trusting him, Jace couldn't deny that Elliot seemed genuine in his efforts. Together, they pieced together clues, their shared determination forging a tentative bond. One evening, as they pored over maps and documents in Elliot's office, Jace paused, his gaze lingering on the photograph. She would have hated this, he said quietly. Elliot looked up, his expression thoughtful. Your mother was strong, Jace, stronger than I ever gave her credit for. But she also believed in fighting for what mattered. She'd be proud of you. Jace's throat tightened, but he nodded, the weight of Elliot's words settling over him. Let's just make sure Maggie gets out of this, okay? She's all I've got. Elliot reached across the desk, placing a firm hand on Jace's shoulder. We'll get her back. I promise. Jace sat in Elliot's office late into the evening, the glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. The maps and documents they'd been studying lay scattered on the desk, but his focus was elsewhere. In front of him was the wooden box Elliot had shown him before, filled with the unsent letters to his mother. Each letter was a piece of Elliot's heart, unspoken words that might hold the answers Jace was desperately seeking. He hesitated, his fingers grazing the edges of the papers. He wasn't sure if he was ready to dive into the world his mother had left behind. But something told him the letters might contain the key to unraveling Victor's motives and Maggie's fate. Go ahead, Elliot said quietly, watching him from across the desk. If anyone has a right to read them, it's you. Jace nodded and carefully picked up the first letter, dated years before he was born. The handwriting was neat but slightly hurried, as if Elliot had poured his thoughts onto the page without stopping to edit. Renee, every day since I walked away, I've thought about you. My father called it a sacrifice, but all I've felt is regret. I see your face in my dreams, hear your laugh in every quiet moment. I hope you found happiness, Even if it's not with me. Jace's chest tightened as he read the words. He flipped to the next letter, then the next. Each one painted a picture of Elliot's deep remorse, his longing for Renee, and his fear of reaching out. By the third letter, Jace was no longer just reading. He was feeling, living the emotions Elliot had buried for years. I never knew, Jace murmured, his voice almost a whisper. I never knew how much she meant to you. Elliot leaned forward, his expression soft but serious. She was everything to me, Jace, and losing her, it's the one thing I've never been able to forgive myself for. Jace's hands trembled as he unfolded another letter, this one written shortly after he was born. The words hit him like a wave. I heard you had a child, a son. I've never met him, but I imagine he has your smile, your fire. If I could go back, Renee, I'd give anything to be there for both of you. I hope he knows how lucky he is to have you as his mother. Tears blurred Jace's vision, and he quickly wiped them away. She never told me about this, he said, his voice raw. She never said a word about you, about what you meant to her. Elliot's gaze dropped, guilt flickering across his face. I don't blame her. I wasn't the man she deserved, and I didn't give her a reason to believe I could be. But now, with you here, I want to make things right, not just for her, but for you. Jace swallowed hard, the weight of the letters pressing down on him. It's not that simple. You can't just show up and fix everything. I know, Elliot said, his voice steady but sincere. But I'm willing to try, even if it takes the rest of my life. Before Jace could respond, a thought struck him. He sifted through the letters, looking for anything that might connect to Victor or his schemes. Finally, one letter stood out. It was addressed to Renee, but mentioned someone else, a name Jace didn't recognize. Renee, I know we agreed to keep our lives separate, but I worry about you, especially with Victor Crane getting closer to your circle. Be careful. He's not the kind of man you want to owe anything to. Jace's breath caught. Victor knew her? He knew my mom? Elliot's face darkened as he leaned over to read the letter. It seems so, he said grimly. I didn't know how deep his reach went back then, but this changes everything. Jace's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. If Victor had been involved in Renee's life, it meant his interest in Jace wasn't just about Elliot. It was personal, and that made Maggie's situation even more dangerous. What do we do now? Jace asked, his voice shaking. Elliot placed a firm hand on his shoulder. We use this. Victor won't expect us to know about his past with Renee. It's leverage, and if we play it right, it might be enough to bring Maggie home. Jace nodded, a new resolve hardening in his chest. The letters weren't just relics of the past, they were a weapon for the future, and he was ready to use them. The revelations from the letters lingered in Jace's mind as he and Elliot prepared to confront Victor Crane. Every word felt like a bridge between the past and the present, connecting Jace to his mother in ways he hadn't thought possible. Yet those connections also brought new dangers. Victor's history with Renee wasn't just a curiosity. It was a potential weapon, one they needed to wield carefully. Elliot had arranged a meeting with Victor, using his business connections to orchestrate a situation where Victor couldn't refuse. The meeting would be held at a neutral location, a high-end restaurant in the heart of Atlanta. Elliot assured Jace it was the safest option, but Jace couldn't shake the unease twisting in his gut. As they entered the restaurant, Elliot's posture was composed, every inch the seasoned businessman. Jace followed closely, his fingers brushing the photograph of his mother in his pocket for reassurance. The room was elegant, its polished surfaces and hushed tones a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed Jace's life. Victor Crane was already there, seated at a corner table. His sharp suit and cool demeanor exuded confidence, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity when he saw Jace. He gestured for them to sit, a thin smile curving his lips. Elliot, Victor began smoothly. And the boy. I must say this is an unexpected pairing. Cut the games, Victor, Elliot said, his tone sharp. You know why we're here. Victor's smile widened. I have some ideas, but please, enlighten me. Elliot leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You've been meddling in things you shouldn't. Whatever you think you know about Jace, it ends here. We're not your pawns. Victor chuckled, swirling his glass of wine. Oh, Elliot, always so righteous. But let's not pretend this is just about me. You've been keeping secrets, haven't you? From him, from everyone. Jace's chest tightened, but he forced himself to speak. What do you know about my mom? He demanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. What was your connection to her? Victor's eyes gleamed with something sinister. Your mother, Renee, was remarkable, he said, his tone almost mocking. She had a fire, a determination that drew people to her, including me. Jace felt a surge of anger but kept his composure. What did you want from her? Victor's expression darkened. Loyalty, he said simply. She was in a difficult position and I offered her help, but she refused. She was too proud for her own good. Elliot's voice cut through the tension. You mean she wouldn't play your games? She wouldn't become another piece on your chessboard? Victor's gaze flicked to Elliot, a hint of annoyance crossing his features. Believe what you like, but Renee's decisions had consequences, ones that affected both of you. Jace gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists. You used her, he said, his voice low but fierce. And now you're trying to use me, but I'm not going to let you. Victor's smile returned, colder than before. Brave words for a boy who doesn't know what he's up against. Before Victor could say more, Elliot placed the letter on the table, the one mentioning Victor by name. Victor's eyes narrowed as he scanned the page, his confident facade slipping for the first time. You kept this, Victor muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. Elliot's gaze hardened. Renee was stronger than you gave her credit for, and now her son is too. Whatever leverage you think you have, it's gone. Walk away, Victor, or this letter becomes very public. Victor's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Then, with a sharp exhale, Victor leaned back, his expression unreadable. You think you've won, he said quietly, but this isn't over. It is, Elliot said firmly. Stay away from Jace. Stay away from Maggie. This is your last warning. Victor's eyes flicked to Jace one final time, something inscrutable in his gaze. Then he stood, straightened his suit, and walked away without another word. As the tension in the room eased, Jace let out a shaky breath. He turned to Elliot, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think he'll keep his word? Elliot hesitated before placing a reassuring hand on Jace's shoulder. Victor doesn't forget easily, but he also knows when he's beaten. We've bought ourselves time. Jace nodded, though unease still lingered. For now, at least, the immediate danger had passed. But the journey wasn't over, not for him, and not for the legacy his mother had left behind. As they left the restaurant, Jace felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The confrontation with Victor had been a step toward reclaiming his life, toward building something new. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The confrontation with Victor Crane left a palpable tension in the air, but for Jace, it marked a turning point. As he and Elliot stepped out into the cool Atlanta night, the weight of unanswered questions and looming threats felt lighter. They had stood their ground, armed not only with courage, but with the strength of the past. Victor's retreat had given them breathing room, and Jace knew this was his chance to chart a path forward, not just for himself, but for the legacy his mother had left behind. Back at Elliot's penthouse, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. Jace sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights, the photograph of his mother in his hand. Her smile seemed to carry a quiet strength, a reminder that even in her absence, she had never stopped shaping his life. He turned to Elliot, who was sitting at the desk, lost in thought. I want to do something for her, Jace said, breaking the silence. Elliot looked up, his brow furrowed in curiosity. What do you mean? For my mom, Jace clarified, holding up the photograph. She gave up so much for me, worked so hard, and never got the recognition she deserved. I want people to remember her, not just as my mom, but as the incredible person she was. Elliot's expression softened, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his eyes. She would have wanted that. What do you have in mind? Jace hesitated, the idea still forming in his mind. A scholarship, maybe? For single parents trying to go back to school? People like her. She always wanted to finish her education, but life got in the way. Maybe we can help others do what she couldn't. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a small smile. That's a beautiful idea, Jace. And I think it's exactly the kind of legacy Renee would have wanted. Over the next few weeks, Jace and Elliot poured their energy into bringing the scholarship to life. Elliot tapped into his resources, leveraging his connections to establish the Renee Carter Memorial Scholarship. Jace worked tirelessly alongside him, sharing his mother's story with potential donors and ensuring every detail reflected her spirit. For Jace, the process was as much about healing as it was about honoring his mother. Each conversation about her brought back memories, some painful, others comforting. Slowly, he began to see her not just as the mother who had struggled and sacrificed, but as a woman with dreams, strength, and an unyielding love that had shaped his own resilience. Elliot, too, found himself transformed by the experience. The scholarship became more than just a way to honor Renee. It was a bridge between him and Jace, a chance to rebuild trust and create something meaningful together. The letters he had once been too afraid to send became a source of strength, guiding his actions as he tried to live up to the promises he had made to Renee and her son. The day of the scholarship's launch arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves. The event was held in a community center that Renee had once volunteered at, its modest halls filled with people eager to support the cause. Photographs of Renee adorned the walls, each one capturing her warmth and determination. Jace stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. Elliot stood nearby, offering a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, Jace began to speak. "My mom, Renee Carter, was the strongest person I've ever known," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. "She faced more challenges than most people can imagine, but she never let them define her. She gave everything she had to make sure I had a chance at a better life, and even though she's gone, her love and strength are still with me every day." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This scholarship is our way of continuing her legacy. It's for people like her, people who deserve a chance to follow their dreams no matter how hard life gets. I hope it helps them the way my mom helped me." The applause that followed was overwhelming, but Jace barely noticed. His heart felt full, his mother's presence almost tangible in the room. As he stepped down from the podium, Elliot met him with a proud smile. "She would have been so proud of you," Elliot said quietly. Jace nodded, his eyes glistening. "I think she already is." In the weeks that followed, the scholarship became a beacon of hope for countless families. Jace and Elliot continued to work together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined Jace's future. He had found a way to honor his mother, to turn his pain into purpose. As the seasons changed and the scholarship's first recipients shared their stories of perseverance and triumph, Jace felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He still missed his mother every day, but her legacy lived on, in the lives she had touched, in the love she had given, and in the future she had inspired. And for Jace and Elliot, it wasn't just a new beginning. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, redemption, and the connections that bind us, even across time.